Hi, welcome to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And we are continuing a series that we've been doing for several weeks now on the topic of intuition. And this week we're talking about mentorship, finding people who use the learning style of intuition that can mentor you, whether it's directly or indirectly. So if you before you even get into this, if you haven't listened to the other podcasts on intuition that we've done, where we describe what intuition is, we break down the two different styles of intuition, we talk about intuitive blending, all of that great content is on previous podcasts. So go back and listen to some of those before you get into today, because we continue to build upon the things we've already talked about. And so, like I said, today we're talking about mentorship. Mentorship is basically the idea that if you're trying to get across the country, I live here in the United States, I can walk, which might take me a long time, or I can take a jet airplane and be on the other side of the country in a few hours. Mentorship's kind of like that. It's somebody that's been to the destination you want to go. They can speed it up, they can get you there faster, and they can help coach you along the way to whatever you're trying to accomplish. And we're going to kind of talk about that today.
Yeah, and one of the reasons why I really wanted to talk about mentorship is you can see what happens when an intuitive doesn't have guides, or at least healthy guides. Because one of the things I wanted to mention on this podcast as well, beyond just mentorship, is what it looks like when an intuitive is healthy, average, and unhealthy. Unhealthy intuition is... it's a kind of a scary thing, because you already are feeling a little disenfranchised. You're already feeling like you don't belong. And so going down that slippery slope into unhealth, into like sort of maybe paranoia, or feeling like nobody understands you, or feeling really cast out of the tribe.
Yeah. Which
assaults some very ancient programming. You know, if you're a person who's an intuitive and you don't feel like you've ever fit in, and you don't really feel like you're ever part of the tribe, there's a part of you, there's like a really deep animal part of you that literally feels like you might die, right? Because you're not a part of any particular group. Nobody's got your back, basically. And so an intuitive that grows up in an environment where they don't feel like anybody has their back, or they don't really feel like they have, like a future maybe, they can get pretty unhealthy. And it made me think of a situation where I grew up moving a lot. All right, so I've moved all over the West Coast. And I remember moving to this one town. It was a small, relatively conservative town, and I was looking for other intuitives. By this point, I knew what intuition was. So I was looking for other intuitives, and there was a comic book store, and I was like, I bet I'm going to find intuitives in the comic book store. And I like comic books. I'm a, as I've mentioned in other podcasts, I'm a geek. So I love comic books. I love graphic novels, and I love things like gaming, and I used to play D&D and Dungeons and Dragons in high school. So I'm like, okay, so these are my people. I'm going to go hang out with them. So I get into the comic book store. And I am surrounded by, yes, intuitives, but the most unhealthy version of intuitives that I think I've ever been around. Like most of them had not bathed in a while. Right.
What age group are we talking? I mean, paint us a picture here.
Yeah, we're not talking like little kids, like 12-year-olds that don't take showers in the summer, right? Like we're talking adults. We're talking people in their late teens, early 20s, right? Maybe like some of them mid-20s. And most of them hadn't bathed that day. And I would actually argue that none of them had on that particular day that I went into the comic book store. And like a lot of them were overweight, right? And I'm not judging overweight. Like I've got 15 extra pounds on me, so it's not like I'm going to be judgmental about people who have extra weight. But almost all of them were definitely overweight, and they just had this air about them. Like it was midweek. None of them were at jobs, right? Except for the ones who actually worked in the comic book store. And one of them was literally eating cocktail weenies straight from the can, right? Like popped the top off and just like speared those cocktail weenies and was just eating them for, brunch, because it was like early morning. And it's not like any of those things are particularly bad, right? Like being in a comic book store, obviously I don't think that's bad because I was there.
Yeah.
And being overweight is not particularly bad. And not having bathed that day, there's always a reason maybe that you haven't bathed that day. And eating cocktail weenies out of the can is not the death knoller by any stretch of the imagination. But it was the combination of all of it. You know what I mean? Like, it was the combination of all of it. And I just was like, man, you guys have just, like, given up. Like, there is no tomorrow for you. You just don't even want to think about the future. You're just, like, right here, right now. But not in that, like good power of now Eckhart Tolle way.
Yeah.
Like, in that, like, I can't really think about the implications of my actions because it will just make me go in the fetal position and cry. And this makes me so sad. Like, it made me instantly sad for these intuitives that I believe had mostly gotten there by being surrounded by people who didn't understand them, didn't give them any credibility for how they were thinking or the things they were into. They probably had been bullied quite a bit growing up, maybe even by family members. And so there was like nothing left. Like, there was nothing left except for creating this little tribe or cabal. And the reason why that makes me so sad is everything we've talked about with intuition. Everything we've talked about with, like, how amazing it is and how it's a relatively new evolutionary technology.
Yeah.
And how some of the greatest leaders of this and other times have all been intuitives, changed the way that we see reality. Like, amazing things can come from intuitives, and that includes this batch of people. Like, all that potential is right there. It was right there. But it was just buried under layers of, like, lack of self-permission and no self-esteem and no belief that they had any real... They didn't believe they had anything to give.
Yeah.
Like, that's why they'd given up, is because they didn't believe they had anything to give. And they're sitting on a gold mine of, sort of this necessary powerhouse of a gift that could be given to the world in forms of leadership and creativity and just bringing amazing concepts.
Oh, yeah.
And they had no idea. Right? It's like sitting on a treasure that you don't know is underneath your house. So why would you go to the trouble of digging it up? Right? You don't even know it's there.
Yeah, and I think I know the town you're talking about, and there are often towns like this all over the world where there's just no support structure for people to think this way. I mean, if you had been in San Francisco or Portland, Oregon, or maybe London, England, or a bigger city with more things going on, there's probably people that have done this as well, but you're going to find a lot more support structure for people that think intuitive, that learn through intuition. And so I think in particular, people that are maybe in small towns or not in big cities or grown up in families or communities that don't support the way they think, you're going to end up finding this. And that's kind of what we're talking about today, is that people matter in your life. And the people that can, like, be mentors for you matter, because if you don't have that, I don't think this is always how an intuitive ends up, but this is like the dark side of how it could go downward for somebody who hasn't gotten the help to say, oh, I'm not weird, I just think different.
Right. Well, or I am weird, and that's okay.
I'm weird, but in a good way.
In a good way, right. And what's interesting is,
I'm not broken, let me put it that way. I'm not broken, I just think different.
Right. Last podcast, we talked about blending.
Yeah.
And what was interesting is that these intuitives couldn't blend. They couldn't do it. Like, they were not blending. They were standing out like a sore thumb.
They refused.
Yeah,
or
maybe.
were
Or maybe
incapable.
they didn't have the wherewithal. I think you have to be at least an average level of health to be able to blend. Honestly, if you're blending, you're probably at least an average level of health, because you have your finger on the pulse of society enough to be able to look like everybody else.
Yeah.
This level of intuition, like where they were at, or not level of intuition, but the level of health that these intuitives were at, didn't allow them to blend because they couldn't even get their finger on the pulse of society. Like, they couldn't even get to that point. So it really illustrated to me that it's not just embracing your intuition or going, yeah, I'm intuitive, I'm weird. It's not just acknowledging that. It's recognizing that no matter who you are, you can be at various levels of health, right? You can be manifesting your gifts at different levels of health. And if you don't have anybody to guide you, right? Like, if you don't have anybody there that goes, okay, so here are the two paths you can take. One of them ends in eating cocktail weenies out of the can at 11 o'clock in the morning in a comic book store. And the other one ends in, like, running a global empire in which you are the change agent that influences the influencers, right?
Yeah.
And of course, there's lots of other paths that one can take. But it's like, like, do you want to be on the trajectory of giving up? Or do you want to be on the trajectory of, like being a major big game player in the world that we live in?
Yeah. And I think we always talk about playing a big game, like changing the world. But I mean, it could be something like where somebody who's super into comic books and video games ends up changing the video game industry. They come up with some new technology that revolutionizes how we consume video games, for example. So it doesn't have to be like global famine. It could be whatever's interesting to that person at the stage they're at. And when people are young, they might not have global famine on their radar. They might just want to do something cool with video games. Who knows? But it's this idea that you have potential, and if someone can come along and maybe help guide those intuitives toward their potential, that can make all the difference in their lives.
Yeah, absolutely. So this concept of not just embracing your intuition, but also adding to that, working to become the highest level of health that you can be as an intuitive, I think they go hand in hand. Mm-hmm. It's not just going, okay, I'm intuitive, I can just sing to the world that I'm different and I'm weird and I'm a weirdo and you guys have to accept me as I am. Well, not really, right? Like, yeah, you could be one of the good weirdos or you could be one of the bad weirdos. Not that these kids in the comic book store, I call them kids now because, they were in their 20s and I'm now in my mid to late 30s. I'm actually in my mid 30s for a little while longer. I have a birthday coming up that's officially going to tip me over into mid to late. But right now I'm still in my mid 30s. And so right now they feel like kids to me.
Yeah.
At the time they didn't feel like kids, but they feel like kids to me now. And I'm not saying that that's like the bad, like those are the bad form of intuition. I actually think the bad form of intuition are like the truly evil, sort of the Charles Manson, the Hitlers, these were all intuitive guys too.
Yeah.
And they were change agents in a really, really, really bad way. So that's darkness. And I think that there's probably a little bit of mental illness in there too. I don't think all intuitives have to have mental illness. I don't think they all have to be crazy people, good or evil crazy. But that said, when you add this component of health to, hey, I'm intuitive, hear me roar, right? And then you add the component of health to it, now you can actually truly be a positive force in the world. And like you said, it doesn't have to be, like curing war on the planet, right? It doesn't have to be like, global peace. It can be just whatever way that you want to make an impact. And that's totally fine. Health needs to come with it, though. A healthy version of who you are as an individual needs to be a part of the package. Because otherwise, the more influence you get, right? Like, let's say you are intuitive and you embrace it and you reach out for something big and you didn't do any development work, right? You didn't do any health work on yourself. You didn't try to improve yourself. Now you have just as much ability to do damage influentially as you did good if you had worked on your personal level of health.
Yeah. When we talk about health, I think that we talk about, like these kids you're talking about, these people you're talking about, as an example, you kind of need health to grow, and you get health when you grow. Like,
yeah.
It's kind of this double-edged sword of, it's going to be really hard for someone in a position where they've been denied their intuitive thinking for so long. They have been in a community and around family members that may just have not supported it, have really downed it, have tried to force them to do the normal sensory type living. And it's going to take a very special person without any help from the outside to rise up through that and still maintain a level of health. And when we talk about health, maybe we should break that down, what we actually mean by healthy, because I think we're throwing that, you kind of defined it a little bit in kind of example, but what do we mean by a healthy intuitive? And I think how I would define it is somebody that they kind of realize who they are, and they realize that they're eager to grow, and they're searching for ways to continually improve and grow. Like, I don't think health is something you arrive at. I think it's something you're on a journey of, a process of. And so if you have it in your mind, kind of that magnet in the middle of the field, hey, I want to continually grow and develop. I don't know exactly how that's going to work right now, but I think that's a healthy expression of your intuition, to say, I want to grow. I want to learn how to use this intuition better. I want to become a better version of myself. I do want to change the world, and whatever that means for me. And I want to seek out other people and mentors that can help me do that. I think that's a measure of health. And that does come from within, but it also can be sparked by something from without.
Yeah, definitely.
There's this two double-edged sword to the growth and the health and all this.
Yeah, well, yeah, I think you're right. I think that they definitely walk hand in hand. And for me, health is usually an expression of not being totally self-consumed.
Okay.
For me, I mean, and I think health can obviously, like mental health and personal health and your personal development health can be defined in multiple ways. I think for me, when I usually think of somebody as being healthy is I think of them as not being so myopic, right? Like the more myopic we get, the smaller our worlds get, the more we're just focused in ourselves and our own personal needs and just getting those needs met or our desires met. The more we focus on what feels good to us as opposed to, creating some sort of ecology around us. I think the more we go down that road, and that doesn't even mean that person's not a nice person. I've known plenty of nice people who are massively self-absorbed, right? They're nice to you. Like they wish no ill upon you, and yet they have no ability to be helpful to anybody outside of themselves because they're just totally self-absorbed, totally self-consumed. And I think that the more unhealthy we get, the more we're on a trajectory of self-consumption. The more healthy we get, it seems like the more we're able to sort of see outside of ourselves. I ran into this great word not that long ago, and I hadn't heard it before. It's called externality. And the word externality is in reference to in like the environment or people or animals or whatever that gets the end result of an action that they didn't ask for. So, like, I remember hearing...
Well, that's everybody being born, right?
Yeah, right, exactly.
Your parents had sex, conceived you, and now you're here.
And there you go, and that's your externality. Or the externality of the act of sex of your parents. I remember reading someplace that there was some sort of company, I want to say battery company, but I don't know that was just dumping all this toxic chemicals into a river in Mexico. And the villages down the river that had been using this river as their source of water forever, their babies started being born with like the brains on the outside of their skulls. Like it was horrible. And it ended up being that all this toxic waste was being dumped into the river by this company up the river. And so the babies, being born with massively horrible abnormalities, that was the externality of the act of the company up the river. So I feel like, at least on an intuitive level, the healthier we are, the more we kind of instinctively get this concept of externality, right? Like we don't want to just be nice to people. We want to make sure that our actions are creating positive impact for the people around us.
Yeah.
And the healthier we are, the more we have our finger on the pulse of that. And the less healthy we are, the more damaged our externality is because we're just kind of stomping around, right? Like we're so self-involved, we're so self-consumed, we just sort of stomp around. And then if somebody ends up being in our path, like we don't even think about that, right? We're like, well, that's their problem that they happen to get in our path. So when I think of like intuitives that are healthy, I think of the ones that have the most positive externality.
Yeah. They think in ecology of the systems around them and realize if I poke this here, it might pop out over here. Everything has caused, like everything works together in a system to create an emergent. And that's kind of how I see the world now. And that keeps growing as they go forward. Yeah,
exactly. So kind of tying this back to the original concept of mentorship, it's difficult when intuitives that have been on the receiving end of a lot of bad externality, like people who don't intend to look at you like you're totally messed up, and yet they still are, right? Because they just don't get you, right? And so their action is confusion, and your result is, like self-doubt and feeling bad about yourself and lack of permission. If an intuitive doesn't have somebody to say to them in some capacity, hey, you're not the only one like this, and it's not a fault, right, of either person. It's just a systemic issue. It's like they just don't get how you think, and you kind of get how they think, but they don't get how you think, and so that's just how it works, and that's actually a good thing. It's not a bad thing, right? Like that's all right. If you don't have anybody that says that to you ever in your entire life, it is very easy to close in on yourself.
Yeah.
It is very easy to assume that you are massively broken. So just having a single mentor in your life, just one person who goes, you're not the only person like you, right? And here's an example of how it can look when it's good. Just having one of those can be massively impactful to an intuitive.
Yeah, we were talking earlier this week, both of us, we tend to like people that are similar personality types to us. Mm-hmm. And we kind of like I like to look at people like Robin Williams, for example. I know he just recently passed away at the time of this recording, but he is my personality type. And like, I like to see what he's achieved in his life as someone that uses intuition the same way I use intuition, and how he's been able to make his way in the world. Now, obviously, at the end of his life came down to a tragedy, in my opinion, but it was interesting to see how he embodied intuition. Russell Brand would be another person who uses the same intuition that I use, and watching him and how he performs and interacts as a celebrity. And there's other business people that do the same thing. And I like to do that. And you were talking about Richard Feynman.
Yeah.
One of your kind of pseudo heroes. You never met him, but you kind of look at him and see how he's used the intuition in his life in a way that was be very similar to you, because you're similar personality types, and what he was able to accomplish, the impact he was able to have.
Well, and I remember reading his biography when I was younger, the Surely You Just, Mr. Feynman, and he just really couldn't care less what other people thought. He just really couldn't. Like, he was always in trouble in school, and he doesn't really go into it too much in his biography. I think it was Surely You Just. He has 2 books that I remember reading. One of the 2 of them, he kind of talks about how he was, he's this little rebel in school.
Yeah.
And he was always getting in trouble, and he just didn't care. He just didn't care. And I remember thinking, man, I wish I didn't care like he didn't care. I did, and I'm glad that I did, because it made me sensitive, and it had me going into more of the social sciences as opposed to the hard sciences like physics.
Yeah.
That said, he was a mentor of mine. From a young age, he was a mentor of mine, because he gave me an example of somebody who was very similar to me, and same personality type in the Myers-Briggs system, in the Genius system, exploration, accuracy. And so he was a mentor to me because he was able to show me how it can look when you just keep going down your path.
Yeah.
Totally celebrated person, by the way. Everybody loved him.
Yeah.
Except for whoever he cheated on. Whichever women he was cheating on at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, okay, you're listening to this podcast. You're an intuitive. You've heard the podcast leading up to this. We're talking about the series of intuition. You understand what this intuition thing is. You understand the difference between introverted and extroverted intuition, because we talked about that. And you realized, hey, maybe I'm blending. Maybe I need to embrace my intuition and move forward. And now you're like, what's my next step? I wish I had somebody that could guide me, or a mentor to look toward. And you're probably asking yourself, what's the next piece of this? And that's what we're talking about today, is mentorship. So let's start breaking down for that person listening that has gone through this whole series. What are we talking about mentorship? Are we talking about like an apprentice where you go and like work for somebody? Are we talking about like people at a distance? We just mentioned people we've never met before, that were kind of mentors to us in a way, through their books or through their movies or through their personas. Mm-hmm. So what do we mean by mentorship, and how do we, I guess let's start unpacking some of this for people.
Yeah. So I would say that I remember writing a list of the 5 people that had impacted how I thought the most. Mm. And so these would be people that I would call mentors, people who had made my life easier, that they had made it more of a, like you said, you can walk across the United States or you can take a jet across the United States. And these were people that helped me, catch the plane, so to speak. One of them I never met because, well, if you include Richard Feynman, 2 of them I never met because they died before I even found their books. Mm-hmm. So they mentored me through their concepts and through what we call, in a previous podcast, I think we talked about time binding, which time binding is the ability to write down or record information in something like a book or some other media. And so other people that don't live at the same time period that you do, or maybe didn't talk to you directly, get the benefit of your wisdom.
Yeah.
And so some of my mentors, my mentorship happened through time binding. Like I picked up the book after the person had died. And they were mentors to me because they really impacted how I thought about reality. They changed and shifted and broke something loose inside me as I was reading the words. And one of the people that has been one of my profound mentors in my life, I know, but I know very casually. Like, we have no relationship with each other to speak of. I just know them, and if I wanted to send an email, they may or may not email me back. You know what I mean? like that's the kind of relationship we have. And then two of the people are people who were in my life on a daily basis. Like, I had a very strong, profound relationship with them, like a one-on-one, very intimate relationship. So mentorship can come in a lot of different ways. It can come through time binding. It can come through a hero, somebody who, you might know personally and they're influential, but you don't have a strong relationship with them necessarily. But you have a strong relationship with their information. And then it can come through people that you are intimate with. In fact, I would say of these 5 people, one of them is not someone that I would particularly note as being, like somebody that I would follow in the personal development realm. Like, I don't see them as being a terribly healthy version of themselves. And yet something they said really, really touched me. Something that some of the information that they had to share was very profound for me. So I think mentors can be found in a lot of different ways.
Are all the people on your list, because I actually haven't done this exercise, which I probably should, are all the people on your list intuitive?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, every single one.
I'm guessing that as an intuitive, you can have mentors that aren't intuitive as well. We're specifically talking about intuitive mentors, and these people just happened to also all be intuitive. That ended up on your list.
Yes.
That impacted your thinking, which makes sense.
And very similar personality types to me. They were all, like we talk about in the previous podcast, introverted intuition that we call perspectives, or extroverted intuition that we call exploration. And I didn't think about it until just now, but 4 out of the 5 are exploration. Only 1 is perspectives. And I'm exploration. That's the kind of intuition I use. Yeah. So they really they struck a chord with me. And that makes sense because they were using the exact same style of intuition that I was. And I didn't recognize that until much later. So yeah, they were all intuitive, and they were all, besides 1, they were all exploration intuitives. So I think mentors don't have to necessarily be physically in your life. And I think a lot of intuitives end up using books and writers of books as their mentorship program.
Yeah. Well, it makes sense because if you're in a small town, you're outside of a big city, or you just don't have that tribe around you, you're probably, if you've been listening to this and you've listened to the series, you've probably already been attracted to books that are intuitive minded, and you're probably already digesting that information, embodying it, learning from it, and you're already on a path of mentorship, most likely. Well, heck, you found this podcast, not that we're propping ourselves up as like ultimate mentors or anything, but you're listening to this podcast as an intuitive, most likely, because you're enjoying the information that's coming from it, and you're able to use that to learn and grow in your intuition and in your personal development life because of some of the things we're talking about here and some of the interactions in the community on the Facebook page, et cetera, like that. So I think it's really, you probably are already doing it if you're listening to us.
You have mentors, most likely.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, though, that there is something to be said for mentors that are alive now and people that you could form a relationship with if you wanted, because there is a feeling if you only have mentorship through books, and especially people who've already died, if you only have those kinds of mentors in your life, then it can feel really lonely. Like, I'm out of time. Like, I'm in the wrong time period. I should have been born in a previous time period where all these great thinkers were around. The truth is that there have been great thinkers throughout all of history, and there's a crop full of great thinkers happening right now. So there's no real out of time experience for intuitives. I mean, 1 in 4 people is intuitive. It doesn't feel like a lot when you are bumbling around looking for another intuitive, but that's 25 out of 100, right? Yeah. There are great thinkers, and not to say that censors are not great thinkers. We're talking about a specific style of great thinker, though. We're talking about the kind of great thinking that you can personally identify with. And so, not to denigrate any other style of thought, but we are talking about a need going unmet, specific need for intuitives going unmet. And so, oftentimes, it happens through books, and yet, I personally don't think that might be enough.
Well, I think the other thing that, if you're listening to this, you have language now to identify what you have kind of always known all along. The books you've been reading and the people that you see, that maybe you follow, some of your personal heroes or mentors at a distance, or even personal mentors in your life, there was, in the back of your head, you knew there was something different, and the reason you were interested in what they had to say, their information, their lifestyle, whatever, it was probably the intuition you're picking up. And now you have language for this. This actually gives you you're in a great position to be able to see this and have language to speak to it, because now you're able to identify that and have a way of like targeting in on it. Because you're going to be able to weed out stuff that, oh, I see, this is a line of thought that's definitely, building up my intuition. Oh, this is a line of thought that's not really intuitive thought. This is great. They're mentoring me in business or whatever over here, but this is a way that the intuition's coming out. I see how this is happening now. And it's going to help you, I think, craft a better plan for mentorship, for growth. With this language, it's really powerful to have this language and this lexicon under your belt now.
Oh, totally. Well, and I think that's why people get really tired of personal development products, because they'll get a personal development product that is tailored for somebody else's personality type and it won't work for them.
Yeah.
And they blame the program or the product when really it could just be that it was tailored for somebody else, for somebody slightly different. Once you understand your personality type, once you kind of get how you work and how you operate, you can start looking for materials that suit you. Right? Like that are like this person is my personality type and they figured out how to solve this problem, and I'm going to take their advice because this is the same problem that I'm facing. And so they figured it out. So I think having that language is really powerful.
Yeah. I remember reading a book. I think it's called Getting Things Done. I forget the author. It just escaped me. You think about it, let me know. It's probably on my shelf right over here,
Dave something or other.
It's probably over there. So as I talk, look for it. See if you can see the author's name. Anyway, long story short, I remember reading this book, and I think we've actually had a conversation about this, where he gives great advice to kind of get things done, to organize your life, to get the to-do list, and he does it in a very particular style that appeals to a very particular style of knowledge worker, of a person who works in an office environment, and he speaks to a very specific style of personality. And I know that for me, some of the suggestions he was giving just don't work for me. Dave Allen, that's who it is.
Dave Allen
just came to me. It just doesn't work for me particularly. Some of the principles he do work for me, but some of the things just don't work for me because I just think differently than he does and the people he's writing this book for think. And often they're the CEO style person, that really command and control. They're very organized, that style of personality, and I won't go into the specifics of all the details of personality, but it's that style of person that he's writing for. And if you're a person like me reading it, you're like, this doesn't work, this is garbage, this is useless, or there might be some principles, but it didn't really appeal to me that much. But if you're that other style, holy crap, this is the best thing ever. It gets me so organized, I love it, I'm resonating with it, because it's written for that style of person. And so I think what Antonia's saying is that there is, as we think about intuition, there's going to be mentors that come on, not just for intuition, but your specific style of intuition. Because remember, there's two types we talked about before. And these mentors can come along. And it's also good to have the conflicting style as well to mentor you. Because you get kind of iron sharpening iron. You get a different perspective on an intuitive topic that's really powerful as well. Somebody that, we're both exploration people. We hang out with people that are perspectives, and they bring a whole nother level of intuition into the conversation, into the way we see things. I'd like to bring it down to maybe more examples of some intuitives, maybe in popular culture. We kind of brainstormed, we had some ideas before of some of these people and how their intuition potentially is manifesting itself, business, personal development, whatever, and maybe kind of go through some of that just to kind of get some examples for people. Because I know that examples always help me when I'm learning, and I think that could help others as well.
Yeah. Well, one thing I do want to mention before we go into specific examples, though, is that I've noticed that intuitives have a tendency to use books as mentors and less so characters in TV shows as mentors. I think one of the reasons why, even though there's a disproportionately high number of intuitives in TV and movies, like a lot of the characters are intuitive. And I think it's because people are entertained by intuitives. Like they think they're funny and interesting and quirky and fun to watch on the screen, but they don't really want that in their lives. We were talking about Dr. House, right?
Don't come to my family reunion.
Yeah. Yeah, like that.
Stay on the screen, man.
Yeah, exactly. Like that guy is not hilarious, but so fascinating to watch on TV. And if he was in your life on a if he was a real person, and there's gonna be somebody like him in real life, He would not have a bunch of like drilling minions around him that...
Can you imagine having somebody like a Dr. House?
Oh my gosh.
Like you have to work with? I'm sure maybe if you're listening, you might have somebody like this. Can you imagine how that would be horrible?
Yeah. And yet he is an intuitive, and people love watching him. If you're a similar style of intuition as him, if you're a similar personality type, though, there's going to be a little bit of that in you, right? Like you're going to kind of look like that. If you try to like go full on Dr. House, though, I mean, you will get pelted with stones. Like people are not okay with that. They don't want that in their lives. They only want it to be entertained by. And so as an intuitive, even the good examples of intuitives, if you start implementing that sense of, I'm going to kind of go my own direction, I'm not going to really follow your rules, I don't really see your template as applying to me, it's really easy to get dogpiled in this world if you choose to go a completely different path. It's like that adage. Is it a biblical adage that a prophet is without honor in his hometown? I think that's something Jesus said. Yeah. That a prophet is without honor in his own hometown. So if you start to like implement some of these behaviors that you see as potential mentors on, in TV or characters in movies or even novels, it's not going to work out very well for you, or at least it's not going to feel like it does. And so I think intuitives maybe stick their toes in that lake and then like really back off, because it like people are not celebrating them like they are celebrating these characters. So what ends up happening is intuitives end up going the direction of books. I think we just mentioned nonfiction books and biographies and that sort of thing. I think, though, the reason why I wanted to mention that before we start talking about these specific examples is a lot of these specific examples are like the characters on TV. Like that's why we see them as celebrities, because they're not like us, right? They're like these characters on TV. And what you don't realize until you get closer and closer and closer to people who are the ultimate, the penultimate intuitive mentors, like the ones who've made a massive success, is that they did get a lot of backlash for how they were going about things. There was going to be a lot of people in their lives that are like, dude, you can't do that, right? You can't behave that way. And instead of backing off, instead of going, oh, I can't be like that, I'm going to go back to books, being mentored by books, which is not the language you're going to use in your head, but basically that's what you're doing. And I'm going to take these principles in books and then I'm going to apply them to me specifically, and I'm going to feel like, I've got some mentorship going on. They didn't do that. They went full throttle. And if you really want to walk in the steps of these major change agents and these people who have massively influenced, and continue to influence the world, then you're going to have to get through that. You're going to have to get through that time period where everybody in your life looks at you like all of a sudden you lost your mind. And everybody's like, that's not okay. And you've got to just keep going.
I think of, and we'll jump right into this, talking about Dr. House, I think of a real world example of kind of that trial by fire and course correction and healthy development afterward is the person of Steve Jobs. He's an intuitive, and he's, I believe, a very similar personality type to Dr. House on the TV show Dr. House.
Not the exact same, but a really similar.
Very similar personality type. And he was a very intense person before he passed away. And when he started Apple Computer, so Steve Jobs is the CEO, he was the founder and CEO of Apple Computer. And he founded Apple Computer in the 1970s. And by, I think, 1985, he was fired from the company that he started. Basically, they said, we don't want you around anymore. We're going to fire you, because he was so difficult to get along with. He was so abrasive. He was so, he was like, no, I'm going to do it the way I'm going to do it, and that's how it's going to be done. And he got kicked out. And then he went through a time period of growth. He started another company. He basically bought Pixar, which is now owned by the Walt Disney Company. He did a lot of growing during that time, and he actually came back to Apple, I think in 1997, and reassumed the CEO position, having matured and grown. And you can kind of see this two different people through the course of, and he basically saved Apple Computer at that time. You can see how his intuition grew and developed through a story arc of his life, and all the way up until he died. He kept growing and kept having new insights, and he was softening as a person because he was growing as a person through all of this. So I say that to kind of piggyback off what you were talking about, where if you act like this, the world will censor you, and in fact it does. We have examples of this, and the goal is not to, if you're that type of person, to let the world kick you and stay down. It's to grow through it, and the way out is through it. Move through that, become a better version, and then ultimately, you're mature now after some of these experiences.
Yeah. And that's what you're saying is that growth happens or health happens concurrently with that growth. Like you gotta, like the way out is through.
Exactly.
Like you gotta keep going. Your health will increase as you put yourself in situations that give you that baptism by fire. You will become more healthy. Most of the people I surround myself with, or not surround myself with, most of the people I am surrounded by in day-to-day life, like just going to the store, just driving through the toll booth, like just picking up food, whatever. Most people are at a very average level of health. Like they're not totally self-absorbed to a point where they can't have a conversation with you. And at the same time, they're not at a level of health where they're looking to be of service, right? Or they're not in abundance.
Yeah.
Basically what happens when you're healthy, you are in such, like you're getting your needs met to a point where you're in enough abundance that you can start turning that outward and going, how do I help get other people's needs met? Right? Like, and you can just tell those people, you get around them, and even if they're not like, how can I help you in some specific way? They at least have this like smile on their face and they have this warmth and love coming from them, and just being around them feels good, right? Like they're just like, ooh, I just like being around you. It's rare to run into somebody like that. Most people are at a very average level of health, and average will get you by for sure. In order to get to a truly healthy phase or a truly healthy state or level, you have to be willing to take some of those arrows. Like you got to be willing to get through that stuff that really tests your mettle and really has you questioning who you are and what you're made of. And you're right. These people who chose to go that path, they may have started out at a very low level of health. I mean, one of the problems that Steve Jobs dealt with, as far as I can see, is that he was so internally referenced. Like he just didn't care what anybody thought. Like he did not allow himself to get any feedback that was meaningful about what people were going through on an emotional level.
Well, imagine if Steve Jobs had sought out an intuitive mentor, someone who, and I think he did seek out some mentors around business, but what if he'd sought someone out in the personal development end of things as he's building a business? And sometimes when you're 20s, you don't think about this, but, let's say he had done that, maybe his life would, and obviously his life came out good. Like he had a lot of good things that happened. He had a lot of trial by fire, but he could have maybe expedited some of those trials by fire, and he could have accomplished even more because he's an extraordinary person.
Yeah.
And had he had more time, because he hadn't wasted time going through the icky stuff with a mentor, instead of walking across the United States, he could have flown that airplane like I talked about when we first started.
Well, and now Steve Jobs, looking at his life, he becomes a mentor for a lot of intuitives.
Absolutely.
A lot of intuitives look to him to say, okay, this is how I'm going to do it without questioning myself. I'm just going to go for it.
Yeah.
And so he's an example of doing that. And yeah, it was slower. He actually did have some intuitive mentors. What was the magazine? What is that amazing magazine that came out in like the 60s or 50s?
Oh, yeah.
Maybe it was in the 70s.
No, it was the 60s and 70s. Whole Earth Catalog.
Whole Earth Catalog.
I don't remember the publisher's name, but yeah, the Whole Earth Catalog.
Very intuitive. And I think a lot of intuitives used that as their mentorship. They were like, I'm part of something bigger.
Yeah.
And what's great about now is because we talked about things like the rise of the creative class and how it seems like intuition is more and more accepted and celebrated even to some extent on a macro level, maybe not so much on individual lives. But because of that, we actually have a lot more intuitive mentors. The person who I always think of when I think of an intuitive mentor that has built an absolute empire is Oprah Winfrey. Mm-hmm. Like she's an intuitive, and when she says jump, there's about 100 million soccer moms that say how high while they're already up in the air. Like, that woman has an empire, and she's an intuitive. And if you hear her life story, she bulldozed people when she needed to, and she was totally okay with, not listening to other people's criticisms, and she just went for it. And she grew during that time period. Now she's at a point where I don't think she has to bulldoze anymore, and I don't think she wants to. I think she seems to be a person who is more open and more generous than she's ever been in the past.
And you can see her being a mentor to a lot of people, not just intuitives, all people of all types. But I think people do resonate with her. I think intuitives look to her, particularly intuitives that are similar to her personality style. We keep going back to that. Mm-hmm. Probably look at her and say, wow, that's somebody I aspire to be like. I like the fact that she's done what she's done, how she's grown, where she's grown.
Yeah, and I know that this is probably not the intuitive that most people think of when they think of as, like strong mentors. I actually usually often, in my mind, think of Marilyn Manson, which is weird and crazy, I know, because he put so many people off. And yet, I remember after the original, do you remember the original shootings in Columbine?
Yeah.
And like the media was so quick to blame Marilyn Manson's music.
By the way, if you're overseas listening, Marilyn Manson is an American singer-songwriter.
Right.
I don't know if he's putting out new albums now, but he was pretty popular in the mid to late 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, and he's the one that like has like gothic on steroids look, right? And he just looks very, he's got the fake contact that makes his eye look massively dilated on one side, and he's just got this very severe look. And he didn't say anything like when the media was dogpiling him about how he was to blame for the Columbine murders or shootings. He was really silent until finally he decided to speak out. And when he had the first interview that somebody did, when they said, well, what would you say to those two kids who listened to your music? What would you say to them, if you knew that was going to happen? And he said, well, I wouldn't say anything. I would just listen to them. He's like, they just needed to be listened to. And I actually am pretty certain, kind of remembering everything that went down during that time period, that those two kids were probably intuitives themselves. Like the shooters. The shooters were most likely intuitives. Massively disenfranchised, right? Misunderstood, disenfranchised, very, very, very angry. Who knows what is going on inside was going on inside their minds. And yet it could have gone a different direction if they had felt like they had mentorship. And I remember Marilyn Manson saying, I would just listen to them. And I think a lot of intuitives need that kind of mentorship where they feel that they can express. They feel like they're being held, so to speak, right? Like they kind of feel like they're free and open. And I think that's a really great example of what a true intuitive mentor looks like as well. Is not just an example of doing your own thing, but also an example of somebody who's holding space for the other intuitives and giving them an opportunity to have permission to be who they are. So there's a lot of intuitives out there. Like, I mean, if you start pointing out success stories, I think you're probably going to see a disproportionately high number of intuitives. Yeah.
Well, I think for some reason with intuition comes ambition. Not always, but it feels like if you fully embrace intuition, there comes this ambition, everybody has ambition on different levels, but the ambition of impact, ambition of changing something significant, carving your initials into a stone somewhere so you'll remember it, or just seeing some impact happen. It feels good for an intuitive to have that. And it may not be something world recognized, but some kind of impact, whether it's on a small micro level or a macro level.
Right.
It's, I believe it's something that intuitives have kind of written on their hearts, written on their minds for some reason. And sensors do as well, but I think it's something that's deep in there for intuitives.
Yeah, well, I think intuitives, because they're natural problem solvers, they want to solve big problems, and they want feedback. They want the world to have given them feedback for the solution, whether or not it worked. And so they work for impact. Impact is I impacted something, I affected it, I influenced it, and now it's giving me feedback as to whether or not I was on the right path. So I guess to kind of sort of culminate all of this, there's a lot of mentors out there for intuitives. And now that you understand that you're intuitive, and now you understand what kind of intuition you're using, and now you understand that blending is actually a path to unhappiness, and now that you understand the importance of mentors, I highly recommend going out and seeking them. Figure out the kind of mentorship you're looking for at this phase in your life, and look for people who will hold space for your intuition, for how you behave. And one of the things that we have been putting together over the last few weeks is a reboot of a program that we created a while back called the Intuitive Awakening. And the point of Intuitive Awakening is to be a mentorship program for intuitives. And so this is kind of, it's on our minds right now. It's really near and dear to our hearts because this is the impact we want to make, right? Like this is important to us because this is what we want to see in the world. We want to see that we made an impact, that intuitives are sort of waking up and understanding who they are and embracing their intuition and then getting to high levels of health.
Yeah.
So that they can be the best versions of themselves and they can really be change agents in the world. So we invite you, if you haven't been to personalityhacker.com and taken the Genius Style assessment, we invite you to go take the assessment, find out what kind of intuition that you're using, either perspectives or exploration, because the free version of the assessment will tell you that, what kind of intuition you're using. And get signed up in our email, because for the next couple of weeks, we'll be rolling out all sorts of really great resources and tools specifically designed for intuitives, including things like, how do you explain to sensor relatives, maybe a mate or family members or friends, how your mind is working. We've got this really cool little 13-minute webinar that we created about the difference between how the brains work that you can share with the sensors in your life. Just stuff like that. So go get signed up at personalityhacker.com in our email list. Go find out what kind of intuition you have. And then as we're sort of rolling out this information, I really highly recommend you use some of these really great free resources to positively impact your life. Yeah.
Oh, and also come over and help impact other intuitives' lives that are part of this community. It's a growing community. You might have figured out, hey, I have found a great way to find mentors in my life, and here's how I did it. For me, for example, it was going to some conferences around, models of human development, models of the mind, different ways of doing business. The types of events I went to attracted a lot of intuitives, and a lot of those people have become, I'll call them sideline mentors, people that may, they've helped me with little things in my life and mentoring, whether it's business or relationship or whatever. And that's where I've found. So come over facebook.com/personality hacker and introduce yourself. Let us know where you found intuitive mentors in your life, because I think it would help everybody. That's this growing community of intuitives, of people that want to grow. And I think it will really be helpful for you to share your experience with us and other people of how you've done it. And ask questions. Maybe we can get some discussion started around this. I have very full faith that we will. And we can together co-create some answers and some solutions for being an intuitive in the modern world. You can also find us on twitter.com/personalityhack. And like Antonia mentioned, come over to the website and check out all the resources we have there.
Yeah, it's really important to know that you're surrounded by like minds, even if it's virtual.
Yeah.
Even if it's online, even if it's virtual, it's nice to know that you are surrounded by like-minded people. And we have a lot of podcast listeners at this point.
Yeah.
Our podcast has really grown, and that's really encouraging to me, because that means that you are surrounded by intuitives, whether you know it or not. And if you are interested in looking at the Intuitive Awakening, the page is personalityhacker.com/intuitive awakening.
Yep.
And so go check it out if you're interested in that mentorship program. We're going to be rolling it out, the new version, really soon. If you're listening after we rolled out the new version live, that's okay. It's still going to be up there. Intuitive Awakening will be permanently available to all people. So go check it out. personalityhacker.com/intuitive awakening, and come join the conversation.
Absolutely. So my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You've been listening to the Personality Hacker Podcast. We can't wait to talk to you on the next episode.